Okay. Oh, are you say hi? Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fernwood's publishing event, Black Matters, Afua Cooper in conversation with Brandon Wint. To start us off, I would like to acknowledge that I'm calling from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Treaty 1 Territory, the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene people, and on the homelands of the Métis Nation. I acknowledge that I am a settler as an immigrant to this land, and I acknowledge that I am still learning all of the atrocities that have been committed against Indigenous people on this land and continue to be committed against Indigenous people on this land. And I'm working as an ally to ensure that I respect my privilege as a settler in this land. To start us off, I'd like to introduce Brandon Wint. Brandon Wint is an Ontario born poet and spoken word artist who uses poetry to attend to the joy and devastation and inequity associated with this era of human and ecological history. Increasingly, his work on the page and in performance casts a tender but robust attention towards the movements and impacts of colonial capitalist logic and how they might be undone. In this way, Brandon Wint is devoted to poets of world making, world altering, and world breaking. For Brandon, the written and spoken word is a tool for examining and enacting his sense of justice and imagining less balanced futures for himself and the world he has inherited. For more than a decade, Brandon has been a sought after touring performer and has presented his work in the United States, Australia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Jamaica. His poems and essays have been published in national anthologies, including The Great Black Knot, Contemporary African Canadian Poets, Bogdanak House 2013, and Black Writers Matter, University of Regina Press 2019. Divine Animal is his debut book of poetry, which was published this year. Please join me in welcoming Brandon Wint. Hi,
Hello,
Brandon.
hello. Thank you, Oyinda, for reading that probably overly lengthy bio that I sent you. My thanks and my apologies. Yeah, it's an honor, absolutely, to be in conversation with Dr. Afua Cooper. Would you like to? Are you gonna read Dr. Cooper's bio?
Yeah,
Okay, awesome.
I'm going to introduce Dr. Cooper. It is great honor that I introduce Halifax's former poet laureate, Afua Cooper. Afua Cooper, as we all know, is a Black historian. She's someone that I admire a lot. She's also recently been awarded the um, Arts Nova Scotia Award, the Portia White Arts Nova Scotia Award. And we're so grateful and so honored to be publishing Afua Cooper here at Fernwood Publishing. As you all know, her book Black Matters is out right now, and you can grab it from fernwoodpublishing.ca. And for tonight, there's going to be a promo code associated with the book where you can get 20% off for the book for tonight. So as I said earlier, Copa is Halifax 7th Poet Laureate, and she's the author of 5 books of poetry, including the critical acclaimed Copper Woman and Other Poems and 2 novels, The Hanging of Angelique, The Untold Story of Slavery in Canada and the Burning of Old Montreal, and My Name is Phyllis Watley. She's also recorded 2 poetry CDs, including the forthcoming Love and Revolution. She's a founder of the Canadian dub poetry movement, and Afua Cooper was instrumental in organizing this movement between 2004 and 2009. And there's also been 3 international dub poetry festival. It's with great honor and privilege that I introduce Dr. Afua Cooper tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Inda, for that wonderful introduction. Thanks to Brandon for interviewing me.
Yeah, yeah.
And thank you to all our audience.
Yeah.
Yeah, how is this? Okay, okay. Very good.
Yeah. So as we've all said, we're honored to be here today in this conversation. I'm super pleased. This is a little bit of a dream come true since I first started engaging with your work, I think, around 2014, 2015. So I apologize for being late to the party, but I'm glad to be here now. Yeah, congratulations on Black Matters. I really enjoyed the book and have so many questions as a writer and a peer. Firstly, I just wanted to ask how this collaboration between yourself and Wilfred Rousset came together. Was it motivated uh, foremostly by your friendship, or was there always sort of a desire on your part to engage with visual culture and poetic culture at the same time?
Good, good. Yeah, there was always a desire on my part to work with images, to work with visual culture in my poetry. Of course, I've worked with music and dance previously, but never with photographs in this way or other images, certainly. And so in 2017 and also in 2018, I went to Germany. Willie teaches at University of Bielefeld. Bielefeld is a small town in northern Germany, close to Hanover. And so I went there both times to read poetry and also the second time in 2018 to do a seminar on North American Black literature to a group of master's students who are Willie students. Willie is a photographer and he's also a literary scholar. He's a professor of Black studies. So we shared those interests. We had those interests, and we started talking about a collaboration. I think it was Billy who proposed it in 2017, and it just kind of built from there. It developed from there. In 2018, my first daughter Lamarana also came with me to Germany, or came with me to Germany, and we just walked about the city of Bielefeld, taking photographs, just walking around, engaging the landscape, and also doing that. Willie, who also traveled to different cities in Europe and within the Americas, including Canada, shared some of those images from other places um, outside of Europe, but within the Americas.
Okay, okay. And you mentioned just now, and also in the introduction to the book, that the collaboration sort of started taking shape in 2017. Is there, the title of the book is Black Matters, and so I guess I'm curious as to whether, like, releasing a book with that title and with the focus of Black aesthetics and Black visibility in public space, whether it feels different to engage with that subject matter and with a book of this nature in 2020, given all of what we're experiencing now, than it did, during the writing of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because, when Trayvon Martin was murdered in 2013, I think, that was when you had this movement called the Black Lives Matter movement. Of course, there were other movements. They weren't called Black Lives Matter, but that was the intent or the sentiment behind them. But in 2013, you had this very conscious social media type hashtag movement called Black Lives Matter. And of course, that kicked off, that intensified this year with the murder of George Floyd. So we wanted to look at how art mattered, how Black art mattered, how Black, as you said, aesthetic matters. And oftentimes, art that's created by Black people is seen as kind of low art or lowbrow art or whatever. And then it becomes important when it's appropriated by white artists, So like Picasso, he's thought of as founding the movement Cubism, and we all know how Picasso drew his inspiration or absorbed the aesthetic of African art, African sculptural art. So we wanted to say, yeah, Black art matters, and the people who create the art also matter. So it was playing on those ideas, and also not really consciously responding to the movement, but being aware of this phenomenon, this this forward movement that was happening in the world. So, and then in 2020, everything exploded, right? And then our book came out. We didn't time it at all. It,
Mhm.
you know, the hand of God. You have to quote Maradona.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are several events around. How do I want to phrase it? I just mean to point out that, like, it's possible to frame a question around, like, oh, the urgency of Black art at this time in 2020 and responding to disasters, but, like, as a Black artist, it always feels urgent to foreground our aesthetic. So I don't imagine that as you're saying, I don't imagine that uh, this book needed to be consciously timely in order to meet a need, or to have an audience. So I totally understand where you're coming from. Within this idea of Black aesthetics, or sort of the responding to multiple modalities at the same time. uh, One of the poems that I love most in this collection, among many, is the John Ware poem, the John Ware Magician Cowboy, as an example of extending the imaginative breadth of an image and making it broader and more specific, and more just and more caring. And it reminds me of a workshop that I took recently called Revolutionary Poetry, where a poet named Tongo Eisen Martin, put forth the idea in my consciousness that poetry is valuable and useful because it allows us to uh, play with reality. Like create the terms by which reality is constructed, for ourselves. And so I'm wondering, because we're talking in the context of an event called Radical December, yeah, how poetry at this time is sort of settling into, or contextualizing itself within your own revolutionary ethic, or your critical ethic, or your revolutionary practices, if I can use such a loaded phrase.
Right. Well, I think one of the things um, that you can do with poetry, or poetry certainly lends itself to that, or any kind of art form really, is to think outside of time, or
Mhm.
to put yourself outside of time, right? So the genre, because it asks you, it, when I'm saying it, I don't know, it's poetry, who is poetry, what is poetry, but anyway, maybe the muse asks you um, to engage the question of what if, right?
Mhm.
What if? What is the interior life of John Weir? What if John Weir had this tremendous interior life that nobody knew about, right? So that's the question I ask myself. Um, or the poem Jupiter Weir. Um, I borrowed from Franz Fanon, Black Skin, White Mask. What did I say? I said, white mask, black skin. I kind of reverse it. So, what if Jupiter Wise was thinking 200 years in the future and said, oh, I'm going to use Frantz Fanon. I'm just going to be inspired by Frantz Fanon, black skin, white mask. And I'm just going to wear this white mask, which we are wearing now in this time, interestingly, like a physical mask. I'm going to pretend that I'm happy with these people. And then in the dead of night, I'm going to make a run for freedom. So it's like this what if, I don't know. I don't know if Jupiter Wise was a musician, but I also imagine that, you know, he could have been a musician.
Mhm.
That that sort of thing. It allows you to think outside of time sometimes, right? Because as you said, it allows you to create a kind of future that you would want to create, or even to go back in the past, as I did with Jupiter Wise and with John Weir, and to sort of manipulate it a bit.
Okay. And what sort of what ifs are arising for you now? What ifs are you asking yourself in this moment?
You mean in this moment of COVID?
Yeah, or just, in response to any of the events of 2020, what sort of what ifs seem to be on the front of your consciousness? Yeah.
Well, the thing is, um, I hope what we have, and it's for us to make it so, I hope for it to be a sustained movement, right? I often think of, maybe because I'm a historian, what if Harriet Tubman was here, right? Like, say she lands wherever, I don't know, in Regina, and she begins to dispense advice, or people begin to ask her questions because she's a sayer, right? She knows everything, and she can look back and forward and be centered in the present. So it's for us to ensure that this moment is sustained, because speaking specifically about the Black community, you have all these organizations and banks and institutions, people phoning up organizations and said, we want to contribute, we want to give some money to Black kids. Lawyers want to give their services for free. Everybody's kind of on this thing. But hopefully it's not, a flavor of the month situation, but that we are constantly um, inspired by the ethic of justice, that we want all the time to let justice prevail, because that's what it's about. It's a moment and it's a movement for justice in every way. And so to keep our eyes on that prize.
Yeah, thank you for saying so. Yeah, I hear that. I hear that so wholeheartedly. And this is not like a condemnation of any of the movements that are happening, but it is takes like a certain amount of intention and care, and I suppose the ability to connect and collectivize, to sustain like a movement towards justice beyond uh, the sort of lightning rod moments of a protest, or another incident of extrajudicial killing. So I hear you in terms of the need to sort of sustain our movements toward justice, and also just how broad, or like how many iterations uh, action toward justice can take. And I hope for the good of my life and for the good of other lives, that poetry is one of those iterations. Which also brings me to another of my favorite poems in the book, which is "Shots Rang Out on My Street Today," and I wanted to ask you to expand upon one of the refrains in the poem, which is basically that another one dies in the middle passage. It's a among other things, it's a depiction of localized violence, I suppose, in Halifax. And you draw a connection between that violence and the Middle Passage. And so I just wanted to get your thoughts on what you think that connection is, or the afterlife, or the wake of transatlantic slavery, to borrow a phrase from Christina Sharp. What's that connection for you?
Well, definitely there's that big connection. I think that in so many ways we still live in. Stop. Come closer. Thank you. I think in many ways we're still living that legacy, the legacy of the Middle Passage. It hasn't been dealt with. So many, we know that sharks used to follow the slave ships because sharks knew that they would be fed, because black would be thrown off the ship. Millions of people below the ocean, right? There would be the bones that of our ancestors, littered, that's littered the bottom of the Atlantic and other oceans. So, and no one has apologized for us for that. No one has. Well, when I say no one, of course, some people have mourned. We all have mourned, but there's no general or no collective mourning for people who died. So I'm thinking that this Middle Passage and after the after phenomenon still haunt us. Um, so when our young men, primarily young men, have been shot down dead or murdered in any way, shape, or form, and they're like 25 and below, it's well, what the hell? What is going on here? So even after slavery ended, wherever it ended, in whichever part of the Americas, what was ushered in was um, not justice or freedom or social equality for black communities, but segregation, other forms of colonization. I mean, if you look at some of the former slave societies in the Americas, like say Brazil or Jamaica, people couldn't vote. You, what you had after emancipation was an institution of racial apartheid for 100 years. People couldn't vote until 100 years after slavery ended, or even have title to land if they have land, or even get a proper education or send their children to school. So it's like this unending sort of oppression, and then we come to these parts. Whenever we came to these parts, meaning North America, meaning Canada, and then to have our children and our parents and our brothers and sisters die like they shot down in it's it's um it's for me it's like the ghosts are still out there, and the mourning drums have not been sounded enough, and that we still haven't come. What I see many of us do is that we engage in this process of forgetting, which the colonizers want us to engage in, this process of forgetting. Emile Césaire, the Martinican philosopher and poet, he talks about colonialism, or the process of producing something that he calls what does he call it, the forgetting machine. That colonialism is so brutal, it's so deadly, it's so dangerous. But even as it abuses, even as it kills, it produces a situation of where it says, okay, that did not happen. So he calls it the forgetting machine. And so many of us, racialized people, black people, we invoke that machine. We say, okay, let's move on. It's not as bad as it was. Even as we're dying, we say those things. So that poem, yeah, and I wrote it because in one, this should have been 2017 or so, in one, in Halifax, uh, we had like three young men, 27 and under, died, shot down in the street. I mean, like incredible, and for Halifax was a small city, of course, for that to happen, one behind the other, it was quite traumatic for the families of these men, for the city, and then I was pissed off because the mayor, he said, oh, he's looking to the black community to provide solutions. I'm like, what's your problem? Looking to the black community to provide solutions. You know what the solution is? So many people have done reports and all sorts of things. And why don't we just look at certain social and economic conditions instead of listening to the book? So it's but when you look at the Halifax, it's like all over Canadian cities, all over the Americas, all over America, all over Europe. Uh, so it's part of this what someone calls unending this unending quest for justice and for freedom, which you know that never happened. That never happened after the year of emancipation. And we see even right now, today, right now, as we hear the kind of voter suppression that took place in the recent election in the United States, and that continues to take straight up, and these voter suppression, acts of voter suppression are happening in predominantly black areas. Okay, okay. Hmm. Oh, you hear me?
Yeah, the audio's a little bit, a little bit scratchy, but I heard you. I heard you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, on the topic of thank you for that thorough response. On the topic of remembering, I think one of the things that I've always loved about your work, extending back to at least as far back as Copper Woman, is your inclination, your willingness to use poetry and your historical practices in combination to sort of uh, I want to say like create a network or like connect Black diasporas, And one of the poems that did that best for me was Cimarron. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah.
On page 43, where you encounter a Black Mexican young boy selling his wares as you were uh, taking in a performance. And so I'm wondering to what extent a book of this nature and poems of this nature and even your practices as a historian are motivated by sort of the desire to uh, examine the map of Black diaspora, or to assert in some way the ways that we're connected, beyond these borders of nation states and things of this nature. What is your what motivates that sort of connectedness from your perspective?
Sorry, I'm muted. I'm unmuted now. Um, yeah, consciously, one of the things I wanted to do with this book, one of the objectives, um, was to connect with different Black diasporas in terms of, a poetic objective, as opposed to be, rooted in Halifax or rooted in Toronto, but to connect across time in terms of time travel, um, and also across space. So having the opportunity to travel, I was in Spain, that particular poem. I was in Granada. What was just wonderful because being in Granada, you're also in African culture. A lot of people don't know that. Spaniards themselves, I'm sure they know that, but it's also part of the forgetting machine, right? Because Granada was the last stronghold of the Moorish kingdom, 1492. Granada was defeated um, as a Muslim kingdom by Queen Isabella and her army. But you see Africa written everywhere in Granada. The Alhambra, the palace of the Nazarene dynasties from Morocco that ruled Granada and Spain for 700 years, right? So, it's a place where you have a lot of people coming. It's a place where you have many people crossing from so-called sub-Saharan Africa, crossing over the Sahara Desert into North Africa, and then, if they're lucky, they survive the Mediterranean crossing into Spain and Italy. And so there was lots of that, and then you have the people from the Americas, the people from the Hispanic Caribbean and from South America and Latin America there. And so all kinds of people will come up. We will would encounter and interact with all kinds of people, right? Black Europeans, Africans from North Africa and from the Sahel and other places in Africa, and Black Hispanic people from Central America. The person I spoke to was from Mexico, and his entree into a conversation with me was to invoke Yanga. So he said, "Oh, do you know who Yanga was or Yanga is?" I'm like, "Yeah, it is the same Yanga we're talking about. I know Yanga, or know of Yanga. I certainly don't know Yanga. Yanga was around the 17th century, and Yanga was an African Mexican, and the Maroon. who enslaved man who escaped and formed a Maroon Republic up in the mountains in the Yucatan area. And Yanga's objective was to bring liberation to Mexico, to defeat the Spaniards, and to free all the African slaves, right? But the way how the Mexican historiography has been created, um, it's like the liberation movement began in the uh, 18th or 19th century. And of course, when you do that, there's no mention of Yanga and the African Maroons who started the first wars against Spain, right? So connecting with this man in Granada who was selling jewelry and realizing again the precariousness of life for many of the people, kind of running from the immigration police and people are undocumented and so on. It's kind of, and at the same time, being in that space where, and I can tell you that speaking English was, was, was kind of like an asset because when say the authorities, the cops and whomever and the racist people, they hear you speak English, they said, oh, they think you're an American or something. You're not like a real African. Just this imperial language, this language of privilege of English, when you spoke in certain parts of, the kind of response you get from it. But to get back to your question about creating and connecting with diaspora, it's always it's always an objective of mine. Where I go, I want to see um, because I've seen it. I've seen it. I've seen it in Paris. I've seen it in Africa, a neighborhood called Chateau Rouge, where Africans are here, and then the immigration, the French police, they just bust down. It's like a whole field of them. There's a van that comes and they jump out of the van and they start running after people and they start asking people for their ID. And if you don't have your ID, you're carted into this van and, because they think you're an illegal immigrant. And it's just this kind of vulnerability of life for black people wherever they are. Um, it like seeing police running people down and kind of hitting them with the baton, men and women. It didn't matter that they were women beating them and asking for their identification. It's quite traumatic, um, you know. And that used to happen here a lot in Canada, certainly in Toronto. I got several cousins who got deported. They were working in restaurants down on Young Street, and the police would bust these places. So then here, West Indian people would work in factories and so on, or go to Dustin Mall, and they would go to the mall and close the mall off, like the bar every entrance and exit, and round people up. So I've seen that in Toronto, and then to go and see that in here again, reinscribe that particular trauma. But I was okay. I can imagine how traumatic it was for the people who were involved. But it's almost as if our lives don't matter, coming back to Black Matter. And then police everywhere can manhandle us and brutalize us. It's, 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 um, it's not right. Yeah, let me try the headphones. And then maybe I could. Let me try the headphones, yeah. How about that, Fazila? Yeah, my headphones are plugged in. I uh, I may just try and sign in on my desktop again. Okay, okay. I'll just come closer.
I
Tell
was
me then he's muted.
I was starting to say that I think that's part of the beauty that this book does, and so much of your work in, like, because so often, as a black person, as a black writer, as a black thinker, the impulse uh, is to think about connecting black diasporas only in their relationship to, like, the trauma of white supremacy. So, like, oh, white supremacy is hounding us over here and white supremacy is hounding us over there, and we all nod our heads like, yeah, it's terrible. And, like, that's real. But I think one of the things that I also honor about this book is the way that you're connecting diasporas uh, as well through markers of beauty and culture, which is, like, I would say, like, an extension of your work as a historian. So it's like we get to see or imagine the connection of John Ware to a past in Africa. We get to experience this young Mexican boy through the resistance of colonial imposition. And so that beauty is something that I think veins its way through so much of your work, and which I really respect. Which brings me to my next question, which is a question about music. Because there's so much music in this book. All poetry has music embedded in it. But I think you're also particularly adept at exercising the skill of putting your particular musicality, your relationship to dub poetics on the page in a beautiful way. And then we have so many references, to the black musical diaspora, through Jimi Hendrix, through Bob Marley, through Phyllis Dillon, so many people. So, like, in addition to interacting with visual culture through photography, you're also doing this thing with music. So just if you would just talk to us about the impact that music has on your poetics, your personhood, your life.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Well, I was born and raised on a musical island, which is Jamaica. So there was music everywhere. I mean, when we were growing up, my parents, the radio was important. Parents used to listen to radio. Um, there was music all the time, right? In the whole sound system culture, like by the time I was a teenager, sound system culture was big. So you'd be in your house and you hear music down the way or down the beach or up the hill or wherever. So it was just a part of our lives. Um, and so all of the names that you mentioned, these people. So, if we take Jimi Hendrix died before I came into consciousness as a person. I think that Jimi Hendrix died in 1967, I was 69. I was about 10 years old. I was thinking of Jimi Hendrix. But his music is legendary. It endured, right? So, so then you came upon this person, and then you'd hear some music. You'd hear Bob Marley singing some songs, and then as you got older, you realize, oh, that's not a Bob Marley original. It's maybe Eric Clapton or even though he wrote many original songs. But the fact that I'm saying is and then the poetry. I'm talking about the poetry, the dub poetry, coming out of this tradition of music, this tradition of spoken word, um, this tradition of rhyming with and wordplay, and everybody like my father and my uncles, they were just they knew how to rhyme. They weren't musicians, but they would often engage in this wordplay. It's so interesting. You hear them talk. And my father could recite these Shakespearean monologues like, friends, Roman countrymen, lend me your ear, which he did in school in grade 7 or whatever. So your ears became attuned to that. So it of course it comes into the poem. I came of age when reggae music was, flowered, was at its height, and you had people like the Wailers. Um, I remember a concert I went to when I was a teenager, Michael Jackson and Jackson 5 came to Jamaica, and they thought they were big stuff, right? And we all went out, so everybody had a crush on the Jackson 5, all the girls, right? And the Wailers opened for the Jackson 5, and that was a huge mistake. Let the whale You opened before the Whalers, because the Whalers gonna go. So the Whalers opened before the Jackson 5, and when the Whalers finished, people got up and walked out of the stadium. And so you had the poor Jackson 5 now had to perform to a quarter empty stadium, you know. But such was the power of the Whalers, right? And so Jamaicans like, yeah, the Whalers perform. We don't need to hear them little boy. All them are gonna do a jump up and down on the stage. That was it. But in North America, the Jackson 5 was huge, right? So it, it, it's a joy. I thought, I had the best childhood um, and the best exposure to art and to culture and to music and to history. So this is how it comes out. And when I say exposure to culture, I was born on an island, and sometimes people can say if you're on an island, then you can be insular. You become insular, and that is true to some degree. But the islands in the Caribbean, these people are insular. These people were very outward looking. And I think it's because of the education we got as kids. I think it's also because you had a grandfather, a grandmother who was born in Panama. And so you always had that thing, like my grandparents were born in Panama, or they went to Colon, or they were in Costa Rica, or they were in Barranquilla in Colombia, and they came back to Jamaica as little children. And then look at the island. The island is composed of people, presently, who came from elsewhere, right? Who came from Africa and Asia and the Middle East, yeah, and from Europe too. The Europeans were the original outsiders who came. So you had an island of people whose roots lay elsewhere. So I think that's part of the reason why we had such a cosmopolitan view, because so the music of other people, of say Jimi Hendrix or that his cohort or that whole genre of music wasn't something that was foreign to us or strange to us or we wouldn't like because it came from North America. We would love it for its beauty, you know what I mean? But also um, it was an island in which people too were grounded in themselves. When I was going to high school, or first year of high school, our first social studies book were some books that were called the people who were here. It was in grade seven. Grade seven, we begin high school in the Caribbean. So the people who were here. So I mean, somebody at the Ministry of Education was thinking wisely. How are we going to educate these little kids? So they said, okay, we're going to begin with the people who were here. The people who were here were the Arawakan people, the Caribs and the Arawaks and the Tainos, and then in Central and South America, the Maya, the Aztec, the Incas. That's what we were learning in grade 7. Then in grade 8 now, they said the people who came. That was their social studies book, the title. And the people who came were the Africans and the Europeans, people from Middle East, people from Asia. And in that people who came content, we learned about the slave trade. We learned about Africa. So these people who came didn't come as immigrants looking for an opportunity or a better life. They were kind of dragged here in the bottom of ships. But what those 2 years did was really to center the child and say, hey, you're here, you're part of people who are here, you're part of people who came. This is who you are. You can't be xenophobic. You kind of have a pluralistic way of thinking about life. And you see that in the music. Um, you see it in the music all the time. And it builds confidence.
Wow, I love that these answers are history lessons unto themselves. I appreciate that. Um, yeah, like extending some of those thoughts. What I think what originally struck me about your work and still is sort of the pulse of this of this work in a way. Uh, your ability to at the same time articulate the present while gesturing at the past is absolutely remarkable, and I think that ability comes through for me most endearingly uh, in the poems that sort of contextualize or rehistoricize your own lineage, your own family. So poems that might reference your father or your grandparents are for me the most beautiful. So yeah, just and especially like honoring the wisdom of the people who raised you at the same time as you honor uh, the wisdom of the earth. And so I'm just wondering what it is that makes poetry such an appropriate vessel for this sort of dual honoring. And I'm talking specifically about uh, the poem "Greener Than Eden," where you speak about your father and grandfather as horticulturists.
Yeah, it was. Thank you. It was a way of that poem to because where I was born in a place called Westmoreland in Jamaica, on this land, on this property, which was it was my mother's property actually. Her father left it for her, and then she got married and brought her husband there, who's my father. You know, he had his land down the road. And to this day, my grandmother, I think, my father's mother is mad that he left her land and went up to his wife's land. But hey, um, that's the way it went. But on that land, my mother's land, her father, before her, he planted all kinds of citrus fruits and all kinds of food, all kind of food stuff. And then my father, who was a mechanic by training, but who had agronomist ambitions. Actually, my dad did want to go to the Jamaica School of Agriculture, and he got in the same year my mother got pregnant with me, so he didn't go. So, but his uncle taught him agriculture, taught my dad agriculture. And so my mother's father laid the groundwork, he planted the place, and my father came and he just continued that tradition. So I grew up on a piece of land, maybe 5 acres of land, where there was a lots of trees. Breadfruit tree. One of the things my dad used to do is for every one of the kids that was born, he planted a tree. Um, Whether it was a June plum tree, whether it was a breadfruit tree, or whether it was an apple tree, um, or a grapefruit tree. So it was just, the place was just flourishing. It just had lots of fruits. And my father and mother, they got um, workers, they got men to plant yam because my father wasn't a full-time farmer. He was a mechanic. He had a job that he went every day. So they had people who would come in and plant yams and did banana. Uh, they call it a banana walk, which would be like groves of banana trees. So that was how I grew up. And then we didn't know our grandfather because he died before we were born. But we heard stories about him, right? The parents talked about it. They said, oh, that grapefruit tree was planted by your grandfather. And that was planted. I'm like, but we just hear about this guy. And he was gone. He was dead. He was buried. But he planted a vineyard for his grandchildren to enjoy. And then there were the uncles who also engaged. My father's uncle, and then my father's brother, my own uncle, who engaged in these agricultural pursuits. So I think it was uh, um, these men certainly took this injunction, if you want to call it that, seriously about being providers for their family. They really took it seriously, and it was important, I think, for them um, living in a colonial space at the time. Certainly, Jamaica was a colony when they were coming up as young people in a colonial space in that really didn't honor or really didn't give dignity to black people. So they had to seek out their own forms of dignity, whether it was through agriculture, whether it was through travel. So another story of one of my grandfathers who had gone to Cuba at the age of 19 to work. Um, and people did that. People went to Central America, right? And they were paid in silver. And coming back to Barbados or to Jamaica or to St. Vincent with silver, it meant that you could buy land, you could purchase land, and you could get a title, and you could marry a woman. Because when my grandfather, at the age of 24, came back from Cuba, um, he felt he could propose to the woman who became my grandmother, right? Because he had something. He could offer her something. He could get the title for the land that he purchased. And if they had children, he could support her. And so it was so important because, again, the context really diminished black people. So they went out and they sought and they created their own dignity. And so that's my legacy, not just personally, Afua's personal legacy of tens of thousands of people. But hearing those stories from from the elders, from my parents, and I met an old timer on the street one day, and when I was in country in Westmoreland, Jamaica, and he said, "You're Miss Ruth's daughter." Ruth is my mom, and I said yes. And he said, "I knew your grandfather. He and I worked together in Camagüey in Cuba." Had no idea. I ran home. I told my mom. His name was the man who said he knew my granddad. Um, his name was, they call him Masa Pita. Mom said yes. As a young boy, he too traveled, right? So other people knew the story of collectively of the people in the town who did what and who went where and who came back. And I also find it interesting that people could place you, and maybe this is one of the things we miss in Canada, is that people could place you by how you look, right? I go to, as a little kid, I go to Savlamara, which is the main town of her parish, and people could look at me and they could tell me who my father was, right? Or who my brother. They said, you're related to so and so, right? I would get annoyed because I don't know these people. But my face, my features, apparently I have my older brother, he and I have the same face, right? And they said, you're Gary's sister. And so that was, I think that also builds confidence as much as I was annoyed because it links you to certain lineages and certain people and to a place and to this rootedness. And but even as much as you're linked to the rootedness and so on, there's a part of you that says, okay, one day when I grow up, I'm gonna travel like my grandfather. You know what I mean? It's not to the same place. Clearly, it wasn't to the same place, but you have there's a possibility that that could happen.
That is, yeah, so that's so remarkable because like one can feel all of what you just said in the book, or like one who engages with your work can feel this sense of both your rootedness and uh, yeah, the sense that you travel with of knowing yourself, but also wanting to recognize yourself in other members of the African diaspora. So it's all really there. So thank you so much for making that so clear, both in your response to that question and in the book itself. We are pretty much coming to the end of our conversation. Regrettably, I wish I could I could learn so much from a conversation like this if it extended for hours. But yeah, just in closing, just if there's any legacy that you want this book to leave, or conversation that you wish for this book to participate in, just in closing, is there anything you want to say for those who are sure to run out and go buy this book as soon as this conversation goes?
Well, I think of life as a dialectic. It's so it's and that's life, right? It's sadness, it's joy, it's 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 beauty, it's pain, and so I I hope that this book starts the conversation of let me put it in plain language, of these opposites, right? That we we carry these opposites in our lives and in ourselves. And so it's not only about pain and brutalization, but about beauty and joy. And, and, and we get beauty and joy in so many ways.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I would hope, um, one of the things people take from it. Especially, as now in this moment of COVID-19, right? We're experiencing all these lockdowns, and some people don't have relatives and or friends or roommates, and many people are alone, and we can't go anywhere. Like we can't even go to a cafe and sit anymore, right? Because in Halifax too, we're in lockdown, and so uh, I'm hoping that poetry can fill a part of this void that we are now experiencing, right now in our life, right? Um, we can still pick up books from the library. Many people don't have money to buy books, but our libraries do curbside pickup, and that I find that really, really heartwarming that we can still get access to literature. Um, yeah, we just have to be each other's keeper, especially in this time. We're living through an interesting time. It's a dread time for many people, and we need each other. We need
Mm-hmm.
each other more than ever.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah.
Um,
So pick up the phone and call somebody and leave them a point.
I will call my grandmother tomorrow because you prompted me to. Thank you.
Okay, good.
we Yeah, we do have one question from the audience, at least, and it's an appropriate closing question too. So everything works out perfectly. Uh, the question from the audience, I'm just going to read it straight as it appeared, and thank you to the audience member who offered this question. The question is, Amani Perry writes that encounters with muddy waters happen in poetry, music, and art because they have. Hold on. Let me. I have to interpret this question before I pose it to you, so as not to do it incorrectly. Basically, it's a question about uh, whether poetry allows you to both write with sharp clarity and deal with irreducible complexity at the same time. I think this is part of what we've been getting at, by retracing your personal history and also talking about, the map of Black diaspora. Just a question of how it is that like poetry helps you write the specificities of your own life while also uh, um, not reducing yourself in any way. You're talking about uh, you're talking about how your father and your grandfather's horticultural practices gave them a sense of dignity. And this question, I guess, really means to ask, how is it that poetry helps you participate in like carving out this sense of dignity for yourself? I would say.
Yeah. I mean, it does help. It does help in that regard, but sometimes it doesn't help. Sometimes I don't think poetry provides the
Mm,
language for everything, right? And so I may turn to other forms of writing, or other, like say history or nonfiction or fiction. But what I like about poetry is that for me, it can be immediate, even though sometimes it might even take 6 months to write a poem, so that's not very immediate. But it's an immediate kind of language that you have access to, and it, what's the word? It kind of compresses things. When you make a zip file and it compresses things, because you want to write a poem and you want it to be short. It could be just one verse or two verses or whatever. You don't have time to write a 10-page paper. Um, a three-verse poem is sufficient. So it gives you that, um, zip file language to do that. And so I like it for that, because if I'm riding on the bus in Halifax, and I get some sudden inspiration, or I see something, and I can take out my pen, or even if I have a napkin, I don't have any writing paper, I can write what's coming to me on the napkin. And if I don't have a napkin, I may be able to write it in the palm of my hand. Um, so that's kind of accessibility that poetry gives that I like. No, I don't know if my parents were poets. I don't know. You don't know everything about your parents. I mean, my dad certainly liked to make. He could make these trees. It's called engrafting. You can take the DNA, the bark from one tree, put it in another tree, and then one tree is growing mangoes and ackee and breadfruit at the same time. So that's quite poetic. Um, but for me, ever since I was a little kid, a poetry kind of found me. And I think the environment in which I grew in country, and then later I went to Kingston, to the big city, was just were perfect vehicles for poetry. Um, but poetry doesn't solve everything. It doesn't solve maybe most of the problems of the world. That's why we have to engage in direct action at times. And we have to go out there and march. And sometimes we have to go out there and join liberation armies and do whatever else is necessary, right? But it's just one of the instruments that we use for self-actualization and for freedom.
All right. What a perfect place to close. Thank you for that. Yes. Poetry in combination with revolutionary action. The poem itself is not the revolutionary act necessarily, but poetry, yeah, is a complement, I would say, to all movement. So thank you so much for your generosity in this conversation. Thank you to Fernwood Publishing for making space for us to have this conversation. Thank you to Radical December for creating the umbrella under which we've sheltered ourselves in this conversation. Thank you to Fazila and Oyinda for their work in bringing this conversation together. I won't say goodbye. I'll say talk to you soon. Yeah, thank you for this. It's been a great pleasure, and thank you to everyone on YouTube and everywhere else in the world who might have enjoyed this conversation and has been our audience this evening, this afternoon. So yeah, have a great day. Have a great Radical December, and see you all soon. Peace and love. Thank you, Dr. Cooper.
Yeah, thank you, Brandon, for your probing and insightful questions. And to
Yes.
Fazila and Oyinda, you guys are great.
All right. Good night, friends.
See you guys later. Thanks for the audience.